Well, hello everybody. Uh, I'm going to put some thoughts together here for you. If you don't know who I am, my name is John Solano. I'm a family counselor. I've been for over a decade, and I've been a professional counselor for over 30 years. I just recently did a video, just not that long ago, a couple of days ago, on something I call trauma promises. If you haven't seen that video, you've got to see that video. That is so crucial for everybody. It just reveals so much. I doubt if you've ever heard that term used before. It's something that I created to describe a particular psychological dynamic that happens when it happens in all of life. But I just happened to focus that particular video on trauma, and it talks about what happens when we get traumatized and how we make promises to ourselves about how we're going to be, how we're going to conduct ourselves, the choices that we're going to make in the future, and how those choices that we make, those promises that we make, are often subconscious and can become very, very detrimental to our relationships. And so please have a look at that. And so I'm also responding to some feedback that I've received from people who have watched the video and have spent time with me in groups and just dialoguing with me about curiosities that they have. And so when I did that video, that last video, I mean, it's a lot to unpackage. So I just did that specific to the trauma promises. And I thought maybe I'd do a part two. And that is basically going to be about how you get untangled from that nasty dynamic. Um, but so anyway, there was some feedback for me, I guess you could say encouragement to get that part two done as soon as possible. But there was also some questions around part of what will be part two when I get to it. And that had to do with a discussion that I had a while back called rather than expect the best from your children or the people in your life, respect the best. Okay? Respect the best. So, in as a parent myself and as a family counselor, I know that family members have a lot of expectations of one another. And in a lot of different discussions that I've facilitated, we've talked about this, about the idea of being expectant parents. So when a child is conceived, we become expectant. And usually the discussion will unpackage that in terms of like, well, what is it that we expect? What's got us so worked up? What's got us so, anxious or full of joy or whatever it is? But what's got us so emotionally worked up? What are we expecting? But what I wanted to focus on here was this idea of being expectant, because the discussion that I had was saying, rather than expect the best from our children and the people around us, why not respect the best instead? What would that look like? And so just a couple thoughts on that. Again, going back to being expectant. When a child is conceived, we're called expectant parents. And we're expecting a lot of things. We're expecting nothing short of a miracle, though, right? We're expecting a blessing, a bundle of joy, a prince, a princess, new life, a second chance, innocence restored. These are the kinds of words that parents use to describe what it means to be expectant. But here's the reality, isn't it? Is that for 9 months, we have no idea what's going to show up really, but we are expectant. And so it's kind of like our expectancy, if you will, what we expect is kind of suspended, and so we kind of have to hang out in this state of expectancy. And so we're called expectant parents. Expectant. We're in it. We're yeah, we're just kind of by necessity, we find ourselves in a suspended state of what we think is going to show up. Um, and and that is it's not only necessary. I mean, there is no choice but other than just to hang out in a state of expectancy, right? And And that is a very difficult thing for the human psyche to do. But the truth is that we don't know what's going to show up ultimately. Kind of like we have this idea, these ideas that cause us to be expectant, but we don't really know what's going to show up. And so, in other words, we have to live also with this reality that whatever we wish for, we might not get. In other words, we're not in a state of entitlement. We don't feel entitled. It's kind of like people will say, "Hey, I'm just so happy the baby was born. I'm just so happy the baby was born healthy," you know, whatever. And so there's this state of expectancy where we also do not have a sense of entitlement. And oftentimes, what I'm seeing is that when parents talk about expecting things from their kids, expecting certain character traits to be present, expecting certain responses, expecting certain um, behaviors. Really, what's hidden underneath that is a sense of entitlement, where parents feel entitled to children acting in a certain way, and so that expectation starts to take on a harsh kind of edge to it, and it ends up becoming more than an expectation, doesn't it? It becomes what we call a demand. So parents start to demand certain attitudes, certain perspectives, certain behaviors from their children. See, I've often said it's this sense of entitlement that kind of rains on our parade. Because prior to entitlement showing up, remember, as expectant parents, we were just kind of suspended, in anticipation, a suspended state of anticipation, a suspended state of expectation. We called it, being expectant. And we didn't have a sense of entitlement at that point. But then all of a sudden, in creeps this sense of entitlement and kind of hijacks this idea of, or, kind of forces this state of expectancy to become this state of entitlement and then demanding. And then, of course, when we don't get what we feel entitled to, then we end up feeling things like tension and frustration and anger, which leads to conflict within the relationship. So it's often this sense of entitlement that we have as human beings that causes a lot of conflict. So that's why I decided to change this dynamic, or this thing that I was trying to describe. It's better then that we move away from this idea of expecting the best, because most human beings can't hang out in that state of suspended anticipation, and they can't avoid drifting into that sense of entitlement. And so that gets misunderstood. So expecting the best. Maybe another way to say that would be remain in a state of suspended anticipation, remain expectant. Because when we're expectant, of course, we hope for the best, but we also have to have some humility. In other words, we don't know what the future is. And that's really that's the metaphor for life. But when we drift into thinking that we deserve this or that we're entitled to it, we get into trouble. And so I shifted this perspective into respecting the best. Now, what does respecting the best mean? Well, most people don't even know what respect means. If I ask a parent for their definition of respect, they might say something like, if only my kids would do what I tell them to do. I say, well, that's not respect, that's called obedience. And there's a really good reason why you don't want obedience from your children. Now, I know that's kind of a hard pill to swallow, but that is really one of the foundational, I don't know, what do you want to say, even the cornerstone of living in a free world. In other words, to allow people the room to be their own person, to have their own thoughts, to have their own spirit, to really honor the uniqueness of every person. And so what that means is that, a parent again may have really, whatever you call it, rigid expectations, maybe demands, and they may want obedience. The best they can actually end up with, if that actually could happen, would be a carbon copy of themselves. Now that might feel comfortable to the parent for a lot of different reasons, And essentially that's what you get when you have really rigid traditional, oftentimes, or cultural boundaries that are very shame based, is that those kinds of approaches are very committed to keeping people in their roles, to not step out of some sort of prescribed role for you, some sort of prescribed script that you have to live out. And that's kind of what we see in a lot of underdeveloped countries, or a lot of communist countries and socialist countries, that's what the attempt is to do. And that has not worked out well historically. Um, Again, even practically speaking, as a parent, if you're demanding obedience, you may get moments of obedience, and you might try to instill that through fear or guilt or what have you. But it's only a matter of time before there's a rebellion, and whether it's in a family or whether it's in a culture, because the human spirit wants to blossom. The human spirit wants to be unleashed, if you will, into the world. And that's both the blessing, I guess you could say, and the burden of living in a free world, is that we give people the room to for their hearts to soar, for their spirits to unfold. And of course, we have to have a discipline around that and how to do that. It's easily said, but it's more complex. I mean, if you just had a bunch of rules that you had to obey, that would not take a lot of work to assemble a set of rules like that. And you'd spend a heck of a lot of time on enforcement. And that's what a lot of these countries do. um, but but when you respect the best in a person, what you're doing is that you're really being able to see what some people call their best self. When we can really see in a person what their virtues are, what their values are that they hold dear, that's why I say respect the best. So when we're engaging one another, it requires a bit of x-ray vision. It requires some maturity. It requires to see through sometimes some behaviors that aren't very good, and remind people of the best of who they are. Now, as a father of a 27-year-old young man now, who's now in the military and has been for a number of years, uh, and he's often far, far away from me, uh, I can't do anything for him, but I can certainly help by reminding him of the best of who he is. We all have our ups and downs in life, and we all get thrown curveballs from time to time, or maybe you've been dealt a tough hand of cards. And a lot of times, those circumstances that we have to deal with cause us to experience a little bit of what I call amnesia. It's like we forget the best of who we are. And it's in those moments that we need people in our lives who can help us remember the best of who we are. Now, not only is that true at such a I want to say kind of a big, meaningful level, but it's also true in our families, because every day as we live together, we're not always our best self. And especially as a mature parent raising a child, for a lot of different reasons, our children are not always going to act, in ways that are ethical or what have you. Um, and really what we're called to be at that particular moment is to remind them of the best of who they are. That's what I call respecting the best. Respect means to look again. I said just a little bit ago that most people don't really even know what respect means. They think respect means obedience. Respect actually means to look again. It's really important that we understand what the words that we're using, and even to take some time to examine some of the most common words that we use, like respect or forgiveness or understanding or integrity or uh, responsibility and accountability. These are pretty standard words that any parent, anybody would really kind of want to use. And so it doesn't require a lot of us to look into those a little deeper and make sure we know what we're talking about. And so, like I said, it only takes me a couple seconds to challenge somebody, a parent, and say, hey, you're not asking for respect, you're asking for obedience. And obedience flies right in the face of what we call individuation. It also flies in the face of your heart's desire, which is for your son or daughter to become their own man or their own woman, and to have their own mind about things. So um, so yeah, that's what oftentimes when parents drift into expectation slash demand, That's, you could say, throw obedience in there as well, and then you wonder why, there's tension and conflict. Um, and so respecting the best, again, is about me keeping my promise. My promise is to love and respect my son, right? So when does he most need my love? When he's feeling unloved, when does he need my respect? My respect means to look again. RE on the front means again, spect means to look. It means to look again. So when I respect my son, I look at him intentionally to see the best in him. And then I go about the business like a lighthouse on a rock. I flash this light to him gently and consistently, always reminding him of the best of who he is. I am respecting the best. When I respect the best in him, guess what? It's very likely the expectations I had, especially the good ones, but the expectations, my heart's desire, my wishes come true. So, really important to know the difference between those two positions. And that's why I sorted those out. And that's why I wanted to unpackage those more for people. And again, as I mentioned, uh, in that dynamic of trauma promises that I mentioned before, being able to use these strategies, because when a trauma promise is in play, people do move into heavy expectation and demands and obedience, and that doesn't work. That causes the relationship to just hit the fan hard. And in order to restore that relationship, a shift from expectation to respect is what's needed. And there's a formula to that I have figured out, just kind of a bit of a few sentences, and how to language that. So when we speak, we are first and foremost reminding the people of the best of who they are, and um, then somewhere down the road we can talk about maybe something that needs to change or what have you. But anyway, just wanted to hit this real quick. I'm not sure if this will be part two, or I'll do something a little bit more formal on part two, to follow up on the trauma promises, and how to get untangled from that nasty dynamic. So I hope this has been helpful. Thanks for tuning in. And if you have any questions or comments, leave those for me. And I appreciate your feedback. Take care.